My name is Anthony. I'm 78 years old, and I've been married for 52 years. I raised 3 children, built a successful career, and thought I knew everything about relationships. But on December 2nd, 2006, 5 careless conversations destroyed nearly everything I'd spent my lifetime building. Today, I want to share the 5 things that should never leave your lips, because words, once spoken, can never truly be taken back. Looking back now, I realize my destruction began with what I thought was my greatest strength. I was the family confidant, the man everyone trusted with their deepest secrets. Growing up in a close-knit Irish family in the 1940s, sharing stories was how we bonded. My mother would gather us around the kitchen table, and we'd trade tales about neighbors, relatives, and anyone else who crossed our path. I learned early that information was currency, and having the best stories made you the most valuable person in the room. When I married my wife in 1954, I brought this habit into our new family. She was quieter, more reserved, but even she seemed to appreciate having someone who could navigate the complex web of family relationships through conversation and shared confidences. I became the bridge between different family members, the one who could smooth over conflicts because I understood everyone's perspective. People felt safe telling me things because I seemed to care, and I genuinely did care. That was the tragedy of it all. My brother-in-law was one of the first to really trust me with something significant. This was back in the early years of my marriage, when we were still figuring out how to be family to each other. He was a proud man, the kind who wore his success like armor, but underneath that confidence was a deep insecurity about providing for his family. Over the years, as we shared beers during holiday gatherings and helped each other with home projects, he began opening up to me about his fears, his business struggles, and, eventually, his mistakes. The relationship that meant the most to me, though, was with my children. When my son was growing up, I thought I was being the kind of father my own dad never was. My father was a man of few words, someone who kept his thoughts locked away like state secrets. I promised myself I'd be different. I'd be approachable, understanding, someone my children could talk to about anything. And it worked, perhaps too well. My son would come to me with problems about school, friends, and later, his marriage. My daughter confided in me about her dreams, her disappointments, and eventually her struggles. I was proud of being someone people trusted. At work, my coworkers knew they could count on me for advice about everything from office politics to personal relationships. I had 40 years to build these professional friendships, and by the time retirement approached, I felt like I'd created a second family at the office. These weren't just people I worked with. They were people who had shared their lives with me through decades of coffee breaks and after-work conversations. Even in my neighborhood, I was known as someone you could talk to. My neighbor across the street and I had developed one of those easy friendships that suburban men fall into. We'd work in our yards on Saturday mornings, help each other with projects, and gradually share more and more about our lives. He knew about my investments, my family concerns, and my hopes for retirement. I knew about his marriage troubles, his financial worries, and his dreams of traveling once his kids were grown. The church community provided another layer of relationships where trust was essential. My pastor and I had developed a friendship over the 15 years I'd been attending services there. When people in the congregation were struggling, he'd sometimes ask my advice about how to help them. When I was struggling, I felt comfortable seeking his guidance. It seemed like the perfect support system. Trust was something I took for granted. Like breathing or walking, I never questioned whether I deserved the confidences people shared with me. And I never really examined my motives for collecting these intimate details about other people's lives. I told myself I was being helpful, that I was connecting people through shared experiences, that I was building stronger relationships by being vulnerable and encouraging vulnerability in others. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs I ignored. The way conversations would sometimes shift when I entered a room, as if people were suddenly remembering all the things I knew about them. The slight discomfort in someone's eyes when they realized they'd told me more than they intended. The way my wife would sometimes give me a look when I shared a story that felt too personal, too detailed, too much like gossip dressed up as concern. But I was proud of being someone people trusted, proud of being the family confidant, proud of having a reputation as someone who understood people and relationships. I thought I was being wise, helpful, even loving. I had no idea that I was slowly building a foundation of betrayal that would eventually collapse under the weight of my own carelessness. I thought I was collecting relationships, but I was actually collecting ammunition that would one day destroy everything I held dear. The false security of believing that sharing stories strengthened bonds rather than weakened them was about to teach me the most painful lesson of my life. The 5 secrets I carried were like loaded guns waiting to go off, and I was too blind to see the danger. Each one felt harmless at the time, just another confidence shared between people who cared about each other. But secrets have weight, and I was carrying enough to crush everything I'd built. The first secret belonged to my brother-in-law, and it went back to 1995. We were sitting in my garage one Saturday afternoon, supposedly organizing tools, but really just avoiding our wives' honey-do lists. He'd had a few beers, and something about the quiet afternoon made him talkative in a way I'd never seen before. He started telling me about a business venture from the late 1980s that had gone completely wrong. Not just wrong, but catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. He'd invested everything into a small manufacturing company with 2 partners. The business looked promising on paper, but within 18 months, they were hemorrhaging money. Bad contracts, equipment failures, a lawsuit from a major client. The whole thing collapsed, and when the bankruptcy papers were filed, he owed more money than he'd ever seen in his life. The worst part wasn't even the debt, though that was crushing enough. The worst part was that he never told his wife the full extent of how bad things had gotten. She knew the business failed, of course. You can't hide a bankruptcy entirely. But she didn't know about the second mortgage he'd taken on their house without telling her, or the credit cards he'd maxed out trying to keep the business afloat, or the fact that they'd come within 2 weeks of losing everything they owned. He'd managed to dig out of the hole over the next several years, but he'd done it by working 3 jobs and telling her the extra work was just temporary contract jobs to build up savings. She thought he was being ambitious. She had no idea he was desperately trying to save their home. He trusted me with something that could destroy his marriage, and I felt honored by that trust. He made me promise never to tell anyone, especially not my wife, because he knew how close the women were. I gave him my word, and I meant it when I said it. The second secret was my own, and it was eating me alive by 2006. As retirement approached, I'd been doing a lot of reflecting on my life, and the thing that haunted me most was how I'd failed as a father during my son's childhood. Not in the obvious ways that make for dramatic stories, but in the quiet, everyday ways that slowly build distance between a father and child. I'd missed his baseball games for business meetings that probably weren't as important as I thought they were. I'd chosen promotions that required travel over family vacations we'd planned together. When he was 12 and wanted to learn guitar, I'd promised to sign him up for lessons and then forgotten about it for 6 months. When he was 16 and struggling with his first heartbreak, I'd been too busy with a major project at work to notice he needed to talk. The guilt wasn't just about missing moments. It was about realizing that I'd trained my own son to stop expecting me to be present. By the time he was in high school, he'd stopped asking me to come to his games. He'd stopped sharing his problems with me. He'd learned to look to his mother for everything because his father was always somewhere else, doing something that seemed more important at the time. Some pain feels lighter when you think you're sharing it, and I'd been carrying this regret for years without knowing how to fix it. My son and I had a good relationship as adults, but I always wondered if he remembered those missed opportunities the way I did. The third secret was actually a good one, which made it somehow more dangerous. Through careful investing and decades of disciplined saving, I'd managed to build a retirement nest egg that far exceeded anything I'd expected when I was young. Smart stock picks, real estate investments that paid off, and compound interest had worked their magic over 30 years of steady contributions. The numbers were impressive enough that I sometimes felt guilty about them. While friends worried about having enough money for retirement, I was looking at financial security that would last well beyond my lifetime. I could leave substantial inheritances to my children, travel anywhere we wanted, and never worry about medical bills or long-term care costs. I wanted someone to know I'd succeeded, someone to acknowledge that all those years of careful planning and occasional sacrifice had paid off. The fourth secret was about my son's marriage, and it was the kind of observation that felt like wisdom, but was really just judgment dressed up as concern. I'd been watching his wife's behavior toward our family for years, and I didn't like what I saw. She was polite enough in public, but there were small slights and deliberate exclusions that added up over time. She'd schedule family activities that conflicted with our gatherings, then express disappointment that my son couldn't make it to our events. She'd make comments about our traditions that sounded like observations but felt like criticism. She'd redirect conversations away from family history or shared memories, as if our past was somehow embarrassing or irrelevant. The worst part was watching my son change in response to her disapproval. He became more distant from extended family, less likely to call just to chat, less present even when he was physically with us. I convinced myself that staying silent was enabling the problem, that someone needed to point out what was happening before it was too late. The fifth secret was the heaviest of all, and it belonged to my daughter. She'd been battling addiction since her mid-20s, and our family had closed ranks around her to protect her privacy and dignity. Multiple rehab attempts, relapses, interventions, and the constant fear that the next phone call would be the one telling us she was gone. We'd carried her burden together, as families should. When she was in treatment, we told people she was traveling for work. When she was struggling, we made sure someone was always available to talk her through the crisis. When she was doing well, we celebrated quietly, privately, because we'd learned not to count on the good days lasting. Now, ask yourself this question. What secrets are you carrying right now? Which of these feels familiar to your own life? Because I can tell you from painful experience that every secret you keep makes you powerful, and every secret you share makes you dangerous. I was about to learn the difference in the most devastating way possible. December the 2nd, 2006. The date is burned into my memory like a scar. It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. My retirement party after 40 years with the same company. The conference room at our office was decorated with balloons and streamers, tables loaded with food that my coworkers had brought from home. There were speeches about my dedication, jokes about finally having time to fix everything my wife had been asking me to repair for years, and genuine warmth from people who had become like family over 4 decades of shared work. I felt sentimental, grateful, and maybe a little too relaxed. My wife looked beautiful in the blue dress she'd bought specially for the occasion. My children were there, proud of their old man who'd managed to build a career worth celebrating. Even some of my neighbors had come, including the neighbor who'd become such a good friend over the years. The pastor from our church stopped by to offer his congratulations and a blessing for this new chapter of life. The atmosphere was perfect for reflection, for sharing memories, for letting my guard down in ways I normally wouldn't. I'd had a glass of wine, then another, not enough to be drunk, but enough to feel warm and open and grateful for all the relationships I'd built over the years. Everyone seemed genuinely interested in my stories, my plans, my thoughts about this major life transition. It felt like the kind of evening where deep conversations were not just welcome, but expected. The first crack in my armor came during a conversation with one of my younger coworkers. He was maybe 35, married with small children, and clearly looking at me as an example of how to balance career and family successfully. We were standing near the refreshment table, and he started asking me about my biggest regrets, what I'd do differently if I could go back and change things. The question caught me off guard in a moment when my emotions were already close to the surface. Instead of giving him some generic advice about working hard and staying dedicated, I found myself getting uncomfortably honest. I told him about missing my son's baseball games for business meetings that I couldn't even remember now. I described the guilt of choosing a promotion that required extensive travel right when my son was going through a difficult time in high school. I shared specific moments that I'd never spoken about with anyone except my wife, intimate details about the pain of realizing I'd trained my own child to stop expecting me to be present. I thought I was just reflecting on life with someone who understood the pressures of trying to build a career while raising a family. He nodded sympathetically, asked follow-up questions that made me feel like he really cared about learning from my mistakes. It felt good to finally voice some of the regret I'd been carrying, like maybe sharing my pain could help him avoid similar mistakes with his own children. The second mistake happened about an hour later when my neighbor pulled me aside to ask about my retirement plans. He knew I'd been smart with money over the years, and he was genuinely curious about how I'd managed to reach a point where I could retire comfortably at 65. The conversation started innocently enough with general questions about financial planning and investment strategies. But then pride got the better of me. I wanted him to see that hard work really does pay off, that all those years of careful saving and smart investing had created something impressive. I started getting specific about numbers, about the actual dollar amounts in various accounts, about investment returns that had exceeded my wildest expectations. I mentioned the rental property that had tripled in value, the stock picks that had paid off spectacularly, the retirement funds that would allow my wife and me to travel anywhere we wanted without worrying about money. I wanted him to know that I'd succeeded, that a working-class guy from a modest background could build real wealth through discipline and smart choices. I thought I was inspiring him, maybe even teaching him something valuable about long-term financial planning. The way he listened so intently made me feel like a mentor sharing hard-earned wisdom with someone who could benefit from it. The third error happened when my wife joined our conversation and mentioned her concerns about our son's marriage. She'd been watching the same patterns I'd noticed, the way his wife seemed to be slowly separating him from our family. Instead of changing the subject or keeping my observations to myself, I found myself agreeing with her concerns and adding my own detailed observations about specific incidents that had bothered me. I described how his wife would schedule competing activities whenever we planned family gatherings, creating conflicts that forced my son to choose between his wife's preferences and his family's traditions. I shared examples of her subtle criticisms of our family's way of doing things, comments that sounded innocent on the surface but felt deliberately dismissive. I talked about how much my son had changed since marrying her, how he'd become more distant and less likely to maintain the close relationships that had always been important to our family. I thought I was supporting my wife by validating her concerns, showing that she wasn't imagining problems that didn't exist. The people listening seemed to understand our frustration, nodding sympathetically as I described the challenges of watching your child's marriage create distance in relationships that had always been strong. Throughout the evening, I noticed subtle changes in how people responded to me, but I was too caught up in the celebration to understand what was happening. Conversations that had felt natural and flowing suddenly seemed more calculated. People asked follow-up questions that felt less like genuine interest and more like fishing for additional information. But I went home that night feeling celebrated and appreciated, completely unaware that I'd just lit a fuse that would soon explode everything I held dear. I thought I was sharing wisdom and building deeper connections with people I cared about. I had no idea I was actually handing out ammunition that would soon be used to destroy the very relationships I thought I was strengthening. The destruction didn't happen all at once. It was more like watching dominoes fall, each revelation triggering the next catastrophe in a chain reaction I was powerless to stop. The first 3 days after the retirement party, I actually felt good about the evening. People called to thank me for the stories I'd shared, telling me how much they'd enjoyed our conversations. I thought I'd strengthened relationships and maybe even helped some people learn from my experiences. The first sign something was wrong came on day 4. My co-worker, the young father I'd opened up to about my parenting regrets, called me at home. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to ask a few more questions about balancing work and family. But his questions felt different this time, more probing, like he was trying to get me to reveal even more personal details about my relationship with my son. When I gave him shorter, more general answers, I could hear disappointment in his voice, as if I wasn't providing the entertainment he'd been expecting. That same week, my neighbor started showing up at my house more frequently, always with casual questions about my retirement plans and investment strategies. He'd bring coffee and settle in for long conversations about money management, asking for specific advice about portfolio allocation and real estate investments. At first, I was flattered by his interest and happy to share what I'd learned over the years. But something felt off about the way he hung on every detail, the way he took notes when I mentioned specific numbers or investment firms. The gossip machine activated faster than I could have imagined. Within a week of the party, I started getting phone calls from family members with vague concerns about things they'd heard. My sister called to ask if everything was okay with my son's marriage, saying she'd heard from someone at church that there were problems. When I asked how she'd heard that, She mentioned that the pastor's wife had shared something during their book club meeting about families going through difficult transitions. My stomach dropped as I realized the pastor must have repeated something from one of our conversations, probably thinking he was asking for prayers for our family situation. But what started as a request for prayers had somehow become part of the church gossip network, with details getting more dramatic each time the story was retold. At work, the young co-worker who'd seemed so interested in learning from my mistakes started sharing my personal revelations during coffee breaks with other employees. He presented it as inspirational storytelling, talking about how even successful people like me had regrets about parenting choices. But he included specific details that I'd never intended to become office conversation, intimate moments between my son and me that belonged in our family, not in break room discussions. Words have wings, and they fly faster than you can chase them. By the end of the second week, I was getting strange looks from people in the grocery store. Neighbors I barely knew were suddenly friendly, asking about my retirement and mentioning that they'd heard I'd done very well with investments. The financial information I'd shared was spreading through the neighborhood network, and I started feeling like prey surrounded by predators who'd caught the scent of money. The loan requests started almost immediately. A distant cousin called about a business opportunity that just needed a small investor to get started. A neighbor's adult son stopped by to discuss a real estate deal that was too good to pass up. My accountant mentioned that several people had called asking for his contact information, saying I'd recommended him as someone who worked with high-net-worth clients. My financial security, which I'd worked decades to build, suddenly felt like a target painted on my back. Family members who'd always treated me as just another relative started bringing up conversations about inheritance planning and family loans. The respect I'd hoped to earn by sharing my success turned into something that felt more like vultures circling overhead. 3 weeks after the party, my son called with anger in his voice that I'd never heard before. He'd been having lunch with a mutual friend, someone who worked in the same building as my former office. During their conversation, this friend had mentioned the touching stories I'd shared about regretting missed opportunities during my son's childhood. He described specific incidents that I'd revealed, including details about my son's emotional needs that I'd failed to meet during his teenage years. My son was devastated, not just because strangers now knew about painful moments from his childhood, but because he felt like I'd turned our private family struggles into entertainment for my retirement party. He asked me a question that cut straight to my heart. "Dad, how is it that strangers know about our relationship problems before I do? When did you ever sit down with me to apologize for those things you told everyone else you regretted?" I tried to explain that I'd been trying to help a younger father avoid my mistakes, but my son wasn't interested in my explanations. He felt betrayed twice, once by the original failures I'd described, and again by my decision to share our private pain with people who had no connection to our family. The fourth week brought the call I'd been dreading. My brother-in-law's voice was cold and controlled when he asked me to meet him for coffee. When we sat down, he told me that his wife had learned about his financial deception from the 1990s. The information had somehow made its way through our extended family network, probably starting with something I'd said to my wife that she'd mentioned to her sister, who'd shared it with someone else until it eventually reached his wife's ears. 20 years of marriage were now in crisis because a secret he'd trusted me with over a decade earlier had somehow become family gossip. His wife felt betrayed not just by the original deception, but by the fact that I'd known about it all this time and never said anything. She wondered what else he was hiding, what other secrets the family knew about her husband that she didn't. He looked across the table at me with eyes full of hurt and said, "I thought you were my brother, Anthony. Brothers don't do this to each other." I wanted to explain that I'd never intended for his secret to become public knowledge, but the damage was already done. 20 years of friendship and trust had been destroyed by one careless moment when my tongue moved faster than my brain. The fifth domino fell 2 months after the party, when my daughter called me crying. She'd been offered a promotion at work, but during the interview process, her supervisor had casually mentioned hearing about her recovery journey and how inspiring it was to see someone overcome personal challenges. My daughter realized that her private struggle with addiction had somehow become public knowledge, and people at her workplace were discussing her personal business. She'd had to leave the community to escape whispers and judgment, giving up a job she loved and a support system she needed. When she confronted me about how this information could have gotten out, I had to admit that I'd sought counsel from our pastor during one of her relapses. I thought I was asking for prayers and guidance from someone bound by pastoral confidentiality, but somehow her story had entered the church's informal prayer network. Look inside your own heart right now and imagine your deepest shame becoming neighborhood gossip. Imagine the most vulnerable moment of your life being discussed by strangers over coffee. That's what my need for comfort and support had cost my daughter. I had made her private hell into public entertainment, and she would never forgive me for that betrayal. By February 2007, I was sitting alone in my house, calculating the true cost of my careless words. Every relationship I valued had been damaged or destroyed, and I finally understood that I hadn't been sharing wisdom or building connections. I'd been betraying trust for temporary social currency, and the bill had finally come due. February 14th, 2007. Valentine's Day, but there was no romance in our house that evening. My wife sat me down at our kitchen table with the kind of serious expression I'd only seen twice before in our 53 years together. Once when her father died, and once when the doctor found the lump that turned out to be benign. She told me that our family was calling an emergency meeting, and that I needed to prepare myself to listen to some hard truths. The next evening, they all came. My son arrived first, his jaw set in that way he'd had since he was a stubborn teenager. My daughter drove 3 hours from her new apartment in the city where she'd moved to escape the gossip. Even my brother-in-law came, though he wouldn't look at me directly. They arranged themselves around our living room like a tribunal, and I knew I was about to face judgment for crimes I was only beginning to understand. My wife started the conversation. She told me that over the past 2 months she'd been getting phone calls from relatives, friends, and neighbors, all asking about various family situations they'd somehow learned about. She'd been putting pieces together, tracking information back to its source, and every trail led back to my retirement party and the conversations I'd had in the weeks following it. Then they each took turns, and I sat there listening to a catalog of my careless destruction. Each family member shared how my words had hurt them, damaged their relationships, or cost them something they could never get back. It was like watching a surgeon remove organs from my body, one painful revelation at a time. My son spoke first, and his voice carried a pain I'd never heard before. He told me about the humiliation of having his childhood struggles discussed by strangers, about conversations with friends who knew intimate details of his upbringing that he'd never shared with them himself. But the deeper wound was his realization that I'd been carrying regrets about our relationship for years without ever talking to him directly about them. He said, "Dad, you told a room full of people about missing my baseball games, but you never told me you were sorry. You shared your guilt with strangers, but you never shared it with me. How am I supposed to trust you now? How am I supposed to believe that you see me as your son instead of just another story to tell?" His words hit me like physical blows because I realized he was absolutely right. I'd been so focused on the performance of regret, on being seen as someone who had learned from his mistakes, that I'd never actually done the hard work of apologizing to the person I'd hurt most. My daughter's turn was even worse. She described what it felt like to have her addiction struggles become public knowledge, to lose her job and her support system because someone she trusted had turned her private battle into conversation material. Her voice was steady, but I could see the betrayal in her eyes. She said, "Dad, you made my recovery about you. When you told the pastor about my struggles, you were looking for comfort for yourself, not help for me. You turned the hardest thing I've ever faced into your story, your burden, your opportunity to get sympathy. And when it became public knowledge, you weren't the one who had to face the whispers and the judgment." I was. I wanted to explain that I'd been trying to help her, that I'd been seeking guidance and prayers from someone I thought was bound by confidentiality, but sitting there in that room, facing the consequences of my actions, I realized my intentions didn't matter. What mattered was the result, and the result was that my daughter had lost everything she'd built in our community because of my need to share her burden. My brother-in-law spoke last, and his words were the most devastating because they came from someone who had been like a brother to me for over 20 years. He told me that his marriage was in crisis, that his wife was questioning every aspect of their relationship because the secret he'd trusted me with had somehow become family knowledge. He said, "Anthony, you were supposed to be my brother, not my judge and jury. When I told you about my mistakes, I wasn't asking you to fix them or share them or turn them into lessons for other people. I was asking you to carry them with me, but instead, you turned my shame into your story. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt." The room fell silent after he finished speaking, and I realized they were waiting for me to respond. But what could I say? That I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that I'd been trying to help people to build relationships, to share wisdom? Every excuse I could think of sounded hollow and selfish when measured against the pain I'd caused. My wife, who had been silent through all of this, finally spoke. She told me that she loved me, but that she was ashamed of the man I'd become. She said I'd turned our family's private life into public entertainment, that I'd betrayed the trust of everyone who had ever confided in me, and that she didn't know how to trust me with her own thoughts anymore. The moment of clarity came like a lightning bolt. Sitting there in my own living room, surrounded by people whose lives I'd damaged through my careless words, I finally understood what I'd really been doing all these years. I hadn't been building relationships or sharing wisdom or helping people learn from my experiences. I'd been collecting stories like trophies, using other people's pain and secrets to make myself feel important and connected. I wasn't sharing wisdom or building connections. I was betraying trust for temporary social currency, turning intimate moments into entertainment, and using other people's vulnerabilities to feed my own ego. Every confidence shared with me had become ammunition in my arsenal of interesting stories, and I'd finally use that ammunition to destroy everything I claimed to love. The meeting ended with my son issuing an ultimatum that cut straight through my heart. He told me I had to choose between my compulsion to share other people's business and my relationship with my grandchildren. He said that until I could prove I'd learned to keep confidences, he couldn't risk having his children develop a relationship with someone who might someday turn their private moments into public stories. So, I'm asking you, just as a grandfather would, what words are sitting on your tongue right now that could destroy everything you love? Because I can tell you from devastating experience that the temporary satisfaction of sharing someone else's secret is never worth the permanent damage it causes to your relationships. Christmas 2007 was the loneliest day of my life. I sat in my house, surrounded by decorations that mocked the emptiness where my family used to be, and finally understood that I had all the words in the world, but no one left who wanted to hear them. The journey back from the bottom began in January 2008 when I finally accepted that wanting forgiveness and earning it were two completely different things. I spent the first month after that devastating family meeting making lists of every person I'd hurt and every confidence I'd betrayed. The pages filled up faster than I wanted to admit, spanning decades of careless conversations and broken trust. I started with my son, because his ultimatum about my grandchildren had shaken me to my core. I called him and asked if I could come to his house, not to explain myself or make excuses, but to apologize for specific things I'd done wrong. When I sat in his living room, I didn't try to justify my actions or blame my upbringing or claim I'd meant well. I simply owned every careless word and its consequences. I apologized for missing his baseball games and for never telling him directly that I regretted those choices. I apologized for sharing our private family struggles with strangers instead of having the difficult conversations with him that might have actually healed our relationship. Most importantly, I apologized for turning his childhood pain into entertainment for my retirement party, and I promised him that I would never again share anything about his life without his explicit permission. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. My son didn't forgive me immediately, and I didn't expect him to. But he agreed to give me a chance to prove that I'd changed, starting with supervised visits with my grandchildren, where I would focus on being present instead of collecting stories to tell later. My daughter's reconciliation took much longer and cost much more. When I drove to the city to apologize to her, she made me sit in a coffee shop while she explained exactly what my betrayal had cost her. She'd lost her job when her addiction history became workplace gossip. She'd lost her support group at church when her private struggles became prayer chain entertainment. She'd lost her sense of safety in our small town where everyone now knew her most vulnerable moments. I had to own every careless word and its consequences, including the devastating reality that my need for comfort and guidance had destroyed her privacy and dignity. She eventually forgave me, but she never moved back to our town. Some consequences became permanent teachers, and the distance between us was one of them. The conversation with my brother-in-law was the most painful because I knew even before I called him that some bridges can never be rebuilt. When we met for coffee, he listened to my apology with the kind of politeness reserved for strangers. I acknowledged that I'd broken a sacred trust, that I'd failed as a friend and as a brother, and that I understood why he could never confide in me again. His marriage had survived the crisis my betrayal had caused, but barely. They'd gone to counseling and worked through the financial deception that had happened 15 years earlier. But his wife's trust in him had been shattered not just by his original mistakes, but by learning that other people had known about them all along. Our friendship was over, and I had to accept that some relationships don't survive betrayal, no matter how sincere the apology. The hardest conversation was with my wife, because she was the person who had to live with the man I'd become every single day. I had to admit that I'd been using our private conversations as source material for public stories, that I'd betrayed her confidence almost as casually as I'd betrayed everyone else's. I promised her that I would learn new habits and boundaries. But I knew promises from someone who had broken so much trust carried very little weight. Learning new habits required completely changing how I interacted with other people. I instituted a 24-hour rule before sharing anything personal about anyone, including myself. If someone told me something in confidence, I would wait a full day before even considering whether it was appropriate to share with anyone else, including my own wife. I started asking myself 3 questions before speaking about other people. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it mine to share? Most of the time, even when the first 2 answers were yes, the third answer was no. I learned that just because something was true and seemed relevant didn't give me the right to share it with others. The most difficult change was learning to be a listener rather than a storyteller. For decades, I'd defined my value in relationships by how many interesting stories I could contribute to conversations. I had to learn that being present for someone else's story was often more valuable than sharing my own. Silence became my strongest relationship skill, and it was harder to master than any professional ability I'd ever developed. Trust is built in drops and lost in buckets, and rebuilding what I'd destroyed took years of consistent behavior. My son gradually allowed me more time with my grandchildren as I proved I could focus on them instead of collecting material for future conversations. My daughter began calling more regularly when she realized I'd stopped treating our conversations as content for stories I might tell others. My wife's respect for my commitment to change grew slowly as she watched me turn down opportunities to share juicy gossip or interesting information about other people. She started trusting me with her thoughts again when she realized I was no longer treating our private conversations as research for public entertainment. But some things were lost forever and became permanent teachers. My brother-in-law and I never regained the friendship we'd had for 20 years. My daughter's weekly visits became monthly phone calls from a city 3 hours away. My grandchildren grew up with limited memories of their grandfather during their crucial early years because I'd spent that time rebuilding trust instead of building relationships. What I gained from the wreckage was a deeper appreciation for the relationships that survived my betrayal. My wife's forgiveness meant more because I understood how much my carelessness had cost her. My son's trust became precious because I knew how easily it could be lost again. My daughter's phone calls became treasures because I realized how close I'd come to losing her completely. The most valuable lesson was learning that your tongue is not your diary, that not every thought needs to be spoken, and that some stories belong only to the people living them. I learned that the most powerful word in any language is often the one you choose not to say, and that silence can save everything you love. Today, right now, make a choice to guard your words as carefully as you guard your heart, because you'll never regret the words you didn't say as much as the ones you did. Let my regrets become your wisdom, and may your words be few, your kindness great, and your secrets safe. This is Anthony, reminding you that the longest distance in the world is between your thoughts and your tongue, and sometimes that distance can save everything you hold dear. My scars became my wisdom, and I pray that my story becomes yours before you have to learn these lessons the way I did.